Nearly synonymous with the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman brought hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. She also spied for the Union Army and led an armed expedition during the Civil War, then subsequently worked for women's suffrage and advocated for the rights of the elderly. In this vivid and fresh biography, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers University and author of the Frederick Douglass Book Award winner, Never Caught, celebrates the life and achievements of one of the nation's extraordinary women through a combination of scholarship and dynamic graphics. Today, Dunbar will be in conversation with Dolen Perkins-Valdez, Associate Professor of Literature at American University and author most recently of Wench. Let's give a great PMP welcome to Eric and Dolen.
Is this on? Hello? Is this on? Does it need to be on?
Hello.
Yours?
I don't think mine's on either. Sort of on. Mine's on.
Is mine on?
I'm on.
Okay.
Now we're
there we go.
on. We're online. Hi.
Hi, Erica.
Hi, Dolen.
I'm so excited you're here.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I would just want to say I first met her through her editor, who was also my editor, and she had written this book about Ona Judge, who was George Washington's enslaved woman, and I just knew when I met her, I was like, this is a rock star. I want to know her. I want to be her friend. And I'm so happy that that dream came true and that I can call you a friend now. And I'm just so excited about this book. I also, before we start, want to shout out my student who's here. Isaiah Washington is a freshman at AU.
Hi, Isaiah.
I know how hard it is to get all the way over to Union Market from AU. He's a Frederick Douglass Distinguished Scholar, holds the highest level presidential scholarship at the university.
Woot. Good for you.
I'm embarrassing him now. He's from Pennsylvania, where you live.
Where in Pennsylvania? Where's that?
Near Gettysburg.
Oh, near Gettysburg. Okay, but here's the real question. Are you an Eagles fan or a Steelers fan? Say Eagles. I like that answer, too.
So let's just start with the book itself before we start talking about Tubman. It is beautifully illustrated. It's got these wonderful fact sheets in it, maps. It has a genealogical chart. The thing that I love most about this book is that it's beautiful, but it's also an award-winning historian behind it. So I know that the things I'm learning here are accurate, to the best of your knowledge in terms of your research. Can you tell me how the book came about?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, one of the biggest goal for me was to create a book that was accessible, that was beautiful, and that really helped the reader kind of move along visually in the journey of Harriet Tubman's life. And so, to be honest, I hadn't really planned on writing a Tubman biography. I teach Tubman, talk about her a lot, but I had just, as Dolen said, I had just completed another book on another fugitive woman, Ona Judge, and my editor sort of approached me, and we were talking about the fact that we knew the film was going to come out the end of 2019, and she said, well, aren't you sort of the perfect person to write a new sort of biography on another fugitive, on Tubman? And I sort of thought about it for a moment, and there's something very different about writing a biography on someone that nobody knows, that was Ona Judge, who was enslaved by the Washingtons, and about someone who everyone thinks they know, right, Harriet Tubman. So I really sort of sat with it for a minute, and I thought, okay, what can I do? What would be the purpose or the goal of this biography? I mean, there are a number of biographies about Tubman that are quite good. Kate Clifford Larson, Catherine Clinton, they've written good biographies of her. But it's been about 15 years, really, since we've had a biography on Tubman. And I thought, one of the things I'd like to do is to be able to refashion Tubman, for us to think about her as more than the conductor on the Underground Railroad. I mean, clearly that's an important part of her life. It's something for which most people know her for, right? But I was more interested in her as a daughter, as a wife, as a mother, as someone committed to suffrage, as a military hero in the Civil War, and as a person who lived beyond, really sort of lived through the shortcomings of life after slavery. And so I thought, all right, I'll do this. It'll come out around the time of the film. And I knew also that the film was really going to focus on a relatively short period of her life, right? The period that most people know something about. What I was hoping for was that people would either go to the film or leave the film and say, but what else? What else do we want to know about Tubman? Tubman lives until she's 91 or so years old, and the film really captures this sort of 12-year period of her life. And so I decided, all right, let's do this. Let's do something that is visually appealing, attractive, that's going to pull in new readers. Also, I wanted to write something that could be read across generations. So older readers and older readers reading to younger readers. And because we don't have photos of Tubman, the earliest photo we have of Tubman is, of course, the one that's on the back of the book, right? So the one that's on display now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that's the earliest known photo that we have of Tubman. And it's a photo from the late 1860s or so. So she's in her late 30s, early 40s. I wanted us to be able to think about Tubman as a girl, as a teenaged person, as a young adult, and to do it visually. And so I had the great opportunity to work with a wonderful illustrator out in California. And I said, let's try to fashion her as a child and recognize her relationship with Frederick Douglass. And so she came up with these wonderful illustrations that I think helped the reader to kind of move through her story, from Araminta to Minty to Harriet, and then to Mrs. Davis, right, at the end of her life. And so the other thing, of course, is I wanted it to be fresh and modern, and hence the title, She Came to Slay, and some of the other titles throughout the book, was to really sort of reference the power of women, the way we sort of talk about it today in our kind of lingo today, was to be able to connect that to
Harriet's
Tubman.
homies.
Yes, Harriet's homies. There's a section called Harriet's homies, which are, all her friends. It's like Frederick Douglass was her homie, right? John Brown was her homie. And so when we think about like who were Harriet's friends, like she knew a lot of people, a lot of sort of well-known people. There's a section also called All About the Tubmans, which I think is also really interesting now as we think about her and this sort of idea of her on a $20 bill. I wanted to have kind of financial facts about her. What was the value placed on her life as an enslaved person? What was the bounty on her head? How much did she receive when she eventually got a pension? And I think these are things that are important as we contemplate putting someone who was enslaved on a $20 bill. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, like in this administration. But I think eventually there'll be more room for conversation about that.
I was going to ask about that at the end, because one of my students, when we read this book, had a really good question that I was going to ask you about. But before we get to the $20 bill, tell us, because some of us may be from the Eastern Shore here, this is D.C., a lot of Marylanders around. Tell us about her life on the Eastern Shore and what you found in your research about before she escaped.
Yeah. The fact that, anyone from the Eastern Shore here? Okay. How many of you have been to the Eastern Shore? Okay, there we go. I feel better now. One of the things that's really interesting about Tubman being from the Eastern Shore is it gives us an opportunity to think about what slavery looked like in Maryland, but in particular the Eastern Shore, and to compare it to what we see in other places, right, throughout the United States. So we know that she's born sometime around 1822, we think, in Dorchester County in Eastern Shore of Maryland. And it's really interesting because there's a huge population of free blacks who were sort of living side by side with enslaved men and women. And she grows up in a community where she would live with both parents for some time. Her father, Ben Ross, was enslaved. Her mother, Harriet Green, was enslaved. They were separated at a certain point. Araminta, her name, Araminta Ross. She was about 5 when she was forced to leave with her mother. And so her father would walk 10 miles to see them. She was one of 9 children. And so, like many other enslaved people on the Eastern Shore, she wasn't part of a huge, when we think about sort of mythic plantation life, that wasn't what was happening on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, right? We're talking about smaller farms, smaller numbers of enslaved people who are populating these farms. And really, when Araminta's mother moves with a family, is forced to move, there really wasn't work for Araminta to do. And so she's hired out. And she's like 5 or 6. So this is the moment really when she's first kind of taken from her family. And I wanted us to have an image of her as a child, to think about her, sort of typical kindergartner now, right, in terms of age, maybe tiny, didn't yet have her adult teeth. And she's taken from her mother. And she's forced to work on another farm. And later on in her life, she talks about how difficult that moment was, that she was crying most nights. She was tasked with different kinds of responsibilities. She was to empty the muskrat traps of her new owner. And so I think about that, a 5-year-old's little hand trying to pry open a trap to remove a dead rodent, right? That was one of her main responsibilities. She was supposed to learn how to weave as well. She wasn't so good at that. That wasn't her forte. But she was also, of course, tasked with domestic work. And that's what all black enslaved women and girls were forced to do. And she talks about how, no one taught her how to clean and to cook, but it was expected that she knew when she was 5 and 6 and 7. And she was responsible also for taking care of children. And so she talks later on in her life, in her narrative, about how she was so little that when she was forced to sort of take care of the baby, she would have to sit on the floor while she was holding the baby. She was too little to stand with the child. She was responsible for keeping that child to sleep well. And she would stand over top of the baby for most of the night. And it was Araminta's job to make sure she didn't wake up. And of course, she was 5, 6, 7 years old, and what happened? She would fall asleep too. And her new owner would slept with a whip under her pillow. And so every time Araminta fell asleep, and the baby would wake and cry, she would whip Araminta. And so this was, I think it's important for us to talk about this for a couple of reasons. One, it gives us an idea of what her life was like as a child. But it also reminds us about what childhood meant for enslaved people, right? And when it ends. When does a life of kind of work and toil begin? And for Araminta, it began, she was young. She was 5, 6 years old. And she would continue to be hired out. And this is very typical for the Eastern Shore. She would still, of course, though, because she was hired out fairly close to where her family lived. She stayed in touch constantly with her mother, with her father, with her siblings. And although her life was extremely difficult, being hired out and alone, she also knew the other possibilities that were far worse. She watched her parents and knew about her parents' trauma of having 3 children sold off down south. 3 of her sisters were sold into the deep south. She never saw them again. And so, I think everything is sort of relative. Her life was difficult, but she at least was able to remain in contact with her family and was deeply committed to them for the entirety of her life. So her life on the Eastern Shore was different from what we think in the 1820s and 30s in a place like Alabama or South Carolina, yet still a signpost or signature of enslavement in America.
Now, she grows up with this deep spirituality, this deep Christianity, and as she gets older, it manifests itself as visions in the same way I thought that it did for Nat Turner or even for John Brown, that these revolutionaries who had these visions that God spoke directly to them about liberating their people. That often gets conflated with the head trauma. You name that as some kind of epileptic seizure in your book, and I've also read some people say it was narcolepsy. Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about her spirituality and the connection with the head trauma, and what's your read on that?
I love how you've connected her to John Brown and to Nat Turner, who all believe deeply in their Christian faith and in the visions that they themselves claim to have. And, as a historian, it is, I think, sometimes difficult to write about spirituality and Christianity and these visions. We're often looking for ways to define them that aren't based in sort of in spirituality, right? So it's, narcolepsy, or epilepsy. And yes, those things are in play. But, and for those of you who do know or don't know, she did have a sort of traumatic brain injury when she was really sort of a teenager, what we would call a teenager now. She's 13 years old. She's on her way to the store on an errand, and she crosses paths with a young enslaved man who is attempting to, we don't know if he's trying to run away or if he is trying to avoid some kind of punishment, but he's running and he's in hot pursuit. There's an overseer in hot pursuit. And they all their paths intersect at this general store. And so at this moment, the overseer mandates Araminta to help him subdue this man, to hold him down and to help him catch him. And at this moment, Araminta says no. So I sort of think about that moment as one of her first kind of overt revolutionary, resistance, no, I will not help you capture this man. And that moment where she refuses to do it, he escapes, he gets away. And so this overseer is furious, and he picks up this 2-pound metal weight on a counter, and he hurls it supposedly in the direction of the runaway, but it hits Araminta, and it literally fractures her skull. And she's rendered unconscious, and she's bleeding profusely. And she's in this kind of state for days. And we don't know, of course, this is, the 1830s, modern medicine, there were no doctors going to visit the enslaved in Dorchester County for this kind of injury. But it was a moment that kind of marked Araminta. And we don't often think about her as someone who lived with a disability. But she did after this moment. She had constant headaches. she fell in and out of these kind of narcoleptic, or she called them sleeping spells, where she couldn't be roused. Perhaps we call them seizures. But what we do know is that these could last for minutes, hours, sometimes longer. And when she sort of came out of these seizures, she would report or note that she had had visions. And she believed that these visions were directly from God, and that these visions would tell her things that she needed to know. And later on, when she was on the Underground Railroad, of course, and conducting people back and forth, it would help her know which way to turn and which way not to go, what bridge not to cross. And so it's this interesting moment for her where she's faced with a physical trauma, one that would become a disability for the entirety of her life, but also a moment where her faith grew much stronger. She would, until the end of her life, always sort of see herself as a servant leader. She always attributed all of her work to God. She believed deeply in her faith. And I think as a historian, it was important for me to be able to talk about it in sort of medical, modern terms, but also to recognize that Tubman really believed in her faith and believed in her connections with God, and that it really was the center of her life, and that she relied upon it for the entirety of her life. So her strength and her faith, actually, to me, are some of the most important characteristics of her. When we think about someone running through the swamps and the woods with this disability, knowing that she could fall into this sleeping spell or have a horrible headache that was worse than a migraine that was debilitating. You know, it's actually amazing that she managed to do what she did, making at least 13 trips to the eastern shore of Maryland. And each one of those trips, the success of those trips, she always attributed to her God.
As my daddy used to say, it's hard to argue with success.
Yes.
Maybe it was.
Well.
You know, in the book you say you want to move beyond sort of like the 12, and I'm just moving us through because I don't want to run out of time. You wanted to move beyond sort of the 12 years that the movie covers. You do get into her work as a nurse, as a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War. Later, she has a terrible time trying to get her pension. She spends years trying to get that pension, what the government owes her, and it's not until the second husband dies, right, that she begins to have success with that. Can you speak a little bit about the Civil War years and the service that she gave to the country?
Yeah, I think about what I learned about Harriet Tubman. When I first started writing, and of course I've been teaching Tubman for a long time, but I thought about, like, what did I learn about Harriet Tubman in school? And then I checked with my son, who's 15, and was like, okay, what did you learn? And because then for that moment I was like, ooh, I'm a historian, but I haven't checked to see what my kid's learning in school about Tubman. And really the narrative hadn't changed that much. And I'm quite a bit older than he. So I thought about, okay, how has Tubman been represented in textbooks? And usually it's as, an older woman, kind of head covered. There's a picture of Frederick Douglass nearby somewhere, right? And also it's really just a focus on her time on the Underground. And I thought one of the most fascinating things about Tubman was that she was the first woman to lead a military expedition, period. Like, lead a military expedition in the Civil War. And it was successful. So, I think that it's part of the reason we know less about, or we talk less about that. It's because I think sometimes we render the Civil War as this very kind of masculine space, when we think about soldiers and battalions and we don't really sort of think about women on the battlefield, right? And Tubman was, by 1862, when the war was in full swing, she's up in New England, in Auburn, New York, where she was living, and she was actually summoned by the governor of Massachusetts, who knew her and knew of her exploits, knew that she had rescued nearly 70 people, took them up to Canada, Philadelphia, New York. And he approached her and said, look, we're looking for scouts and spies. And I can think of no better person than you, given what you've done and the contributions you've made to the underground. And so she agrees to go down to South Carolina. But think about this. She agrees to go down to South Carolina. It's 1862. She's still technically a fugitive, because Maryland doesn't end slavery until 1864, right? So she's agreeing to sign up to fight with the Union, to serve the Union Army as a spy, as a scout, and she's a fugitive. So she heads down to South Carolina, and at first they don't give her kind of access to the scouting and spy work that she was actually asked to do in the first place. Instead, it was nursing, which she was quite good at, right? She'd spent a significant amount of time in the outdoors growing up. She was familiar with kind of botanical remedies and things that were in dire need during the war. So she was nursing men back to health. She was helping recently freed people become self-sufficient. And eventually the moment comes where she's built these relationships with formerly enslaved people in the area. And she leads the Combahee River Raid. And because of her relationships with formerly enslaved and enslaved people, she knows exactly where the torpedoes are buried in the Combahee River. How many of you have seen the Drunk History episode of Harriet Tubman, right? That's this thing. That's the Combahee River Raid, where literally she knows exactly where the torpedoes are buried, because why? Who buried them? Enslaved people, right? So they told her where they were. They sail this kind of fleet of ships up the river, surprise the Confederates, take over their stronghold, and liberate 750 people. 700. So when we do the math, it's close to 1,000 people that Tubman liberates in her lifetime. And so when you sit back and you think about the work she did as a liberator, right? It's way more than what she does in Maryland, right? In Maryland, she's taking 2, 3, 5 people at a time, mostly her family, mostly friends, right? And in the book I write, it's sort of like trying to erase a beach and moving one grain of sand at a time. And with her expedition down in South Carolina, it's really a strike at the Confederacy. It's really a strike at slavery. And so it's sort of interesting that after this moment, she has to fight for a pension later on in her life. She's actually never given a pension for being a scout or a spy. She's given a pension later on for her nursing duties, right? But once again, that's one of the things about Tubman that I feel like we need to spend a little more time thinking about, talking about, that I wrote about in the book, and that for those of you who've seen the film, the biopic of Harriet, there's a little sort of taste of that sort of towards the end of the film, but I think there's so much more that can be done there.
And so you mentioned Frederick Douglass, and of course we have our Frederick Douglass Scholars at AU, so we were thinking about the two of them, both of them being from the Eastern Shore, both of them being born around the same time. She's born in 1822. I think he's born in 1818. She outlives him, but they're contemporaries. And you've got this beautiful moment in the book where he endorses her book. And, I won't read it here, but he speaks very highly of her. Do you think that, because Tubman is so revolutionary. She has no patience with Lincoln and his gradual emancipation. She and Sojourner Truth don't hit it off.
She's not feeling it at all.
No, she sends like $1,500 to John Brown. She's like, go blow him up, She's really...
And do it on the 4th of July. Yeah.
And she and Frederick Douglass do bump heads a few times over her sort of, she believed like we can't wait for them to emancipate us. We got to take it. We got to take freedom. What do you think about the two of them as contemporaries? I mean, we know she never does learn to read. He's probably one of the most literate people of his time, period. What are your thoughts about the two of them as contemporaries?
I think what Douglass actually writes about Tubman is so important. When Tubman goes to have her narrative crafted, there are a number of people who are asked to write letters, right, sort of endorsing the narrative. And Douglass writes, and he's very clear. He says, I've received all of this kind of attention, adulation, respect for being an orator, for being a writer. And Harriet Tubman is someone who basically all she got were the thank yous of the enslaved who she helped to rescue, that she remained kind of behind the scenes. To me, it's very kind of indicative of any kind of social justice movements where we see women behind the scenes doing the work, right? Literally moving people, literally shuttling them to freedom, where Douglass never really did that. He was out front, right? On the microphone, at the podium, rather. And I think it's really interesting to be able to compare the two of them, to think about also the fact that her gender, as a woman, and as someone who was also illiterate, she never was able to make the kind of inroads that Douglass did. And Douglass liked the attention. Yeah. Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century. Literally. More than Lincoln, more than anyone else. The most photographed person. He liked that. He liked to be out front. She did not. Right. She liked to be behind the scenes. And part of that had to do with her personality. Part of it had to do with her belief that she really was a servant leader, a servant of God. And so to compare them as contemporaries from the same sort of neck of the woods, but to think about their place in history, it's really interesting, looking at the power of what gender means in this, and how their lives shake out, Tubman was someone who, she was poor for the entirety of her life. She never found her way to the kind of material riches that a Douglass experienced. She struggled. They were, feeding pigs with garbage, picking up garbage, and struggling to make ends meet, really for the entirety of her life. But she still managed, she's also someone who lived through the failures of Reconstruction, of this period after the Civil War, and but she still manages to live, to find love, right? She marries a second time, and he's 20 years younger than her. I was like, okay, Harriet, okay. And, manages to put her family back together, to create a new family as well, even with all of these kind of disadvantages and hurdles. And I think that's one of the things that resonated the most with me when I was writing the book.
And you just perfectly brought me back to my last question before we open it up to the audience, which is the $20 bill question. So one of my brilliant students brought up the point that it seems ironic to put her on the bill when she was not a capitalist. I mean, even when Harriet did get money, she gave it away. She starts the home for the aged and infirm. She gives money to John Brown. I mean, there is an argument to be said that she sort of badly manages her money, but there's also an argument that she wasn't materialistic, and she wanted the pension because she wanted to be able to pay her bills. I mean, she had the house note on the house that she was trying to pay off, and she had a big family there. She had her parents. Her mother lives to an old age. What do you think about that? Like, what do you think about the argument that it seems ironic to put her on the $20 bill when she was so much about action rather than having sort of the vanity of a Douglass?
Yeah, I'm asked this question every time. I'm always asked about Tubman on the 20 and what do I think. And, I understand the excitement behind the idea of Tubman on the 20 and removing Andrew Jackson. Like, I get the excitement behind that. I also know that's not happening with his administration. However, I'm hoping that we start to have more of a conversation about what it means to put someone who was enslaved on our currency when she herself had a value attached to her body. And to help us think about the value attached to black bodies, period, whether it's Tubman or anybody else. And this is not to say I don't want Tubman on the 20. I'm just saying I think that we have to have much more conversation about what that means, what it means to put her, whether she's on the opposite side of Andrew Jackson, or I don't even know what's supposed to happen, but there is something a little unsettling about the notion of her replacing a president, but more specifically her being on currency when we know there were rewards out for her.
And you mentioned the $12,000 bounty here. Was that the that the highest bounty ever? Because I think in contemporary money that would have been close to $100,000 or something. It would have been something like unbelievable.
It was a lot. And here's the thing. Historians actually, we don't really know what all of the bounties were that were on her head. In part because people didn't know some didn't know it was Tubman, it was Moses, it was whatever they called her. One of the only existing ads or advertisements that we have was when she first ran off, right, in 1849. And that was a $100 bounty on her head, which was more accurate. I think the $12,000 might be a little overblown, like that number. But to be honest, historians, we actually don't know. What we do know is that they wanted her. And they wanted her badly, dead or alive, because she was literally going from farm to farm and taking people out of the fields, right? Literally, and sometimes she did sing, for those of you who saw the film, sometimes she did sing. But I think what's amazing is that she returned 13 times and she was always successful. She never lost one person on any of her journeys. That, to me, I was driving down there's an Underground Railroad conference every summer. And so last summer I went and was driving down, and so I'm from Philadelphia. There's no direct way, right, to the Eastern Shore. So I'm complaining and all these little roads or whatever. And, it's that moment where I got myself together, Erica, okay, wait. You're in your air-conditioned car, driving on paved roads to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and it helps you actually sort of contextualize. At that moment, I was like, this woman walked 100 miles, multiple times, used wagons, used trains, and then, of course, went up to Canada as well. And, it's those moments where we sort of think about ourselves as modern people, myself as a historian, and it sort of checks my momentary discontent with anything. When we think about what she did, how she lived, it's almost unbelievable, except for it's true, and we know about it. And it's just sort of, it's an honor to be able to tell her story and to expand on it and to hope that more readers get to know a kind of more complex version of Harriet's story.
Yes, we're opening.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. That was great. What did you think about the movie, about the portrayal of her personality as a person, historical accuracy, and if you know anything about it, about that scene where she comes back the first time and meets her first husband, if there's any information, that was outrageously powerful scene.
Yeah. So I'll do my disclaimer, which is that I know the director and the executive producer of Harriet. So, and I had conversations with them. I did not consult on the film. What I'll say is this. I think that, it's a huge undertaking to try and move forward with a film, a big project like Harriet, to figure out how you're going to cover her life in 2 hours, when she lived 91 years. And also how you're going to appeal to large audiences. And so what I'll say is I think that they stuck pretty much to the skeleton of her life during that 12 or so odd years that it covers. But, I'm a historian, so I'm like the worst person to go to the movies with, right? Like, I'll be like, their teeth didn't look like that, and they didn't have windows in those cabins, I'm the worst person. So, of course, I can watch it and I see where there's perhaps not so much historical accuracy. But I also know that sometimes that's done for specific reasons, right? For how you're writing a screenplay. The scene that you're referring to, I think, is the one where she returns for her husband, right? So we know that Tubman marries in 1844. She marries a man named John Tubman. She actually does not talk about him as kindly in her narrative than what we sort of see in the film, right? So in the film, it's like this love story, right? A deep love story, and one that's almost heartbreaking. I won't say all of it because some of you might want to see the film, but when she returns for him in the film, their love is basically derailed because he thinks she's gone for good and dead, really. Harriet tells a different story in her narrative. And she actually talks about him as someone who wasn't very kind and who sometimes poked fun at her, made fun of her visions, suggested she was a little slow. And so when she leaves in 1849, we don't know the exact status of their relationship. They'd been married for 5 years. They had no children. When she returns, about 18 months later, she goes into hiding immediately. And she sends word to John Tubman that she's there. And John Tubman is a free man. That's the other thing that's important to note. He was not enslaved, but she sends a message saying, I'm here for you, let's go. And in the film, it's very kind of dramatic and heartbreaking and what have you. In the narrative, she's very clear that he returns a response of rejection, that he's unwilling to see her, and that he tells her, you've been replaced. I'm married, and she's free. And any children we have will be free. And so in the film, Harriet's heartbroken when she finds out. In the narrative, she might have been a little heartbroken for a minute, but then that sort of turned to, wait a minute. I just came 100 miles, and you were with what? And she actually says she's ready to fight. Like, she wants to go to the cabin and turn it out. She says that. She says she's ready. She was him and her, right? And then she sort of collects herself and realizes that she can't have any unwanted attention or what have you. And she also says later on that, John Tubman made the decision to let her go. She had to let him go. And so the film really, I appreciated the way the film portrayed them because we do get to see Black love with enslaved people. And I think that's really important. And it was, of course, common and the way in which enslaved people lived and loved with each other. But it wasn't 100% accurate with John Tubman and with Harriet. Sorry. I said, don't ever go to the movies with me. I'm the worst person.
Professor, would you be kind to accept the fact that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man of his period because wasn't just ego. He was attempting to make clear to the world that black people had dignity. He was a portrait of the black man. So I think that's important to say. It wasn't just his ego that was going on. But back to Harriet Tubman. I would like to suggest, coming from a different perspective, in regards to Harriet Tubman's spirituality, if you look only at the historical data, you may come to the conclusion that you reached. But if, in fact, you take that historical data and juxtapose it with the historical biblical data, there's some real strong parallels. For example, Moses didn't have a GPS nor a map. He was led through a wilderness for 40 years. But that's rather astonishing, as well as what Harriet did. Deborah kicked butt, okay, in the Old Testament, and she collected names. Very much like Harriet with the 700. Additionally, Joseph heard from the Lord in his dreams. Wait a minute, there are some parallels which I think history could perhaps be better informed about.
Ooh, I love that. No, I love, and also I think that's what sort of Dolen and I were hinting at, sort of like, well, it's hard not to believe in what Harriet believed in, and that the biblical parallels are evident. What she managed to do on her own, and also with a cohort of people who were convinced that slavery was wrong and willing to help her, it's so amazing that you have to believe there is some divine intervention somewhere there, right? That it couldn't have just been a coincidence or just luck, right? That she's fortunate. And I do think, and I agree with you on your point about Douglass, I do think that while he was someone who did like to be photographed, and he liked to wear different clothes and different hairstyles, this part on this side, that you're right, that this was also about reimagining black citizenship, right? Black humanity, and that he was in many ways the ambassador of that. And he used his platform to remind Americans of this. He had the opportunity to do that. Tubman never does.
Hi.
Hi.
I appreciate how you explored the intersections of her multiple marginalities, specifically her being both black and woman, with you noting how the men in her life attempted to muzzle her at every turn. As you said, John Tubman underestimated her visions. Her two brothers precluded her from escaping. John Brown didn't inform her of the true plans of Harper's Ferry. And so can you speak to this trend in her life and how we can more accurately depict the complex oppression of our historical figures?
No, that's your student, right? Okay. Clearly. Thank you.
First
for that.
year student.
Look,
okay.
You need to take the microphone. Thank you for that. I use the first escape attempt with Tubman to demonstrate how her status as a woman really kind of affected her life. Most people don't know that, her first attempt at escape, like to escape to leave Maryland, was thwarted, right? And it was thwarted because she ran off with two of her brothers. And her brothers got scared. They were in the woods. This was in September of 1849. They were probably hungry, thirsty. None of them were literate, didn't know where they were going, and they made the decision to return to face punishment rather than to face uncertainty. And later on, Tubman talks about how they basically drag her back, that she's unwilling to return, that they have families they've left behind, wives. She too had a husband, she had her parents, but that wasn't enough to make her want to return, yet they physically force her. And it's really at this moment that Tubman makes the decision that no man's going to really make that decision for her again. So when she returns, it's very quickly thereafter that she sets off on her own. And it's when she leaves on her own that she actually encounters freedom. And I use air quotes, of course, because we know that she was not free, that she was a fugitive. And, there's this scene in the film where she's kind of hopping over the state line into Pennsylvania, which sort of marked symbolically freedom. But once again, air quotes, because she's not free. And I think the fact that she does it on her own, meaning alone, not on her own. She had help, but she's alone, is important. And also the first decision she makes when she reaches free soil. And the first decision that she makes is that it's not enough for her to live as a free person, that she had to return for her family and her friends. And she's asking herself the question, what does freedom mean when slavery is all around you? What does freedom mean if you cannot share it with the people you love the most? And it's really at that moment that she makes this decision that she's going to return for all of her family. And she does. She's successful with one exception, her sister, Rachel. And I think that sometimes I'm asked if I could go back and if I could ask Harriet Tubman any question, what would it be? And I have lots of questions, but then I sort of think about my grandmother who'd be like, Erica, some of that's none of your business, so you just don't need to ask. But I would ask, what I know would be appropriate would be, what do you consider any part of that time in the Underground Railroad leading people to freedom, was there a failure for you? We know that everyone you took, you were successful. And I'm pretty certain she would think that her inability to rescue her sister, who died before she, so there's this moment where Abraham Lincoln's elected president. The nation is spinning out of control. We're inching closer and closer to what appears would be a war. And during this moment, Tubman returns to Maryland for her last sibling who's left there. And when she gets there, she finds this kind of heartbreaking news that her sister had died. But even that journey, all of these journeys, she makes alone. And I think that from the moment that she stepped foot onto Pennsylvania soil in 1849, that she's very clear that she'll never let a man chart her path again. She allows them, of course, into her life, into her space, into her circle of friends and family, but she's the boss.
Good evening, Professor.
Okay, wait, before you all start talking. So this woman just got off a plane from some country in Africa. I don't know where but we went to college together, and so she's just surprised me tonight. So we're trying to be cool, but hi, Jessica.
Hi, Erica. I just got off a plane from N'Djamena, Chad, where I'm serving at the U.S. Embassy in N'Djamena, and came to see my friend.
Hi.
One of the most precious things about history is that it should teach us something about today. How would you want us to understand Harriet Tubman's story historically with respect to where we are today?
It's such an important question, because I thought about that as I was writing. And I think right now what many of us crave is a conversation and a life driven by leadership. I think we're all thinking about leadership these days. And what's so powerful about Harriet's story is that in the sort of darkest of moments, as an enslaved person, as a woman, that she positioned herself as a leader. Whether it was on the underground or attempting to get suffrage for women later on, that she was always willing to sacrifice whatever it took, her life, in order to be a social justice advocate. And so I really, when I talk to my college students, the students that I teach, I ask them to think about their vision of social justice and of advocacy, and that when we think about the 19th century, that was Tubman, right? And so I'm hoping that as we move forward, that we continue thinking about her as someone who led people to freedom, but that her entire life was really centered on leadership and on sacrifice and on really centered on issues around social justice. Hi again. See you later.
Hi, Erica.
Hi, Gerda.
One of the thrills of celebrating my 50th birthday was visiting the Harriet Tubman Museum in the Maryland Eastern Shore. I encourage anyone to visit it. We spent hours there. You learn so much about her life that is not presented in schools, one of which included the fact that I believe she had a daughter, and we saw a photo of her with her second husband and this daughter, whose name is Gertrude, and my name is Gerda, so I was very curious. Do you know much about her daughter?
Yeah, so her daughter, Harriet Tubman, had no children with her first husband, John Tubman. And then later on, after she marries Nelson Davis, who fought in the colored troops for the Civil War, they adopt a young child. So we have this one photo of her, which is what you saw, and you're right, it's this wonderful space. It's still relatively new down on the Eastern Shore. You should definitely go to visit. But all we really know about her is that she was orphaned. And in sort of true Tubman fashion, she was always willing to sort of open her home to whomever needed it. But it's the first time that we see her do it and to take on the role as mother. She's also able to do it, and I think it's important, it's a little later in her life, but she's able to do it because she's not on the underground anymore, right? So she's home. She's not running back and forth. And so to me, her life with her daughter, and we actually sort of tracking her later on has been really, really difficult. She stayed around in sort of the upstate New York area, but we don't know a whole lot about her life after Harriet's death. But I think to me, sort of thinking about her daughter, her husband, was another sort of example of her forging a life after enslavement and having the right to control your children's lives, to know that they were yours, whether they were biological or adopted, and to have the ability to live as a family, as a nuclear family. It's another reminder of what so many enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, were trying to do after the Civil War. And so once again, we see Tubman sort of forging away, even in the most difficult of times. But yes, that's the only adopted child that we know of connected to Tubman.
And I think that's all we have time for. So join me in thanking Eric and Dolen. Thank you, Dolen.